All right, as you've seen there, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu joins us next to look at the economic angle to this whole conversation. He is a former Minister of Finance. Thank you for joining us this morning, Dr. Kalu. Well, there are all kinds of angles to it, but it would seem like the most prominent is the economic angle. What do you make of all of the conversation and the uproar that has followed this policy of the federal government through the CBN?
Well, thank you very much. I wouldn't say I followed all the arguments, but let me start preliminary to say a few things. First, this notion of policy, redesigning currency and introducing new ones, even coins, these are age-old routine things that every sovereign state does. So I think we make a mistake when we make it sound like this is a new policy. Now, this is simply one incident in a history of such policies in Nigeria as in other countries. So to say we support this policy as if it's a new policy, there's nothing new about this redesigning currency, introducing some or taking out others, changing, or just all these issues that have come up in this redesign exercise. So it's not necessarily a new policy we say we support, we don't support. Number two, I think it's very clear for us to realize that when you talk about a policy, it presupposes that it's a program, and that program obviously can only be rated in line with the implementation of this policy. So you don't make a distinction between a pronouncement of a policy and how it's implemented. And this our penchant for always saying that we have great policies, it's just implementation, is just really neither here nor there. Unless the process of implementation is subsumed in a policy, there's no way you can judge the two separately. So I think that is for starters. Now, the third thing I should say is that, to my understanding, we are not really talking about issues of this jurisdiction, whether it is a duty of the central bank or that of the attorney general or that of the federal government, the president. The question of jurisdiction only came up when we started to see all kinds of problems with this program. We really should refer to it as a program. You see, it is the province of the central bank to advise the chief executive on their intentions based on the empirical work, based on the work they do. If we need to change the currency because of counterfeiting, we need to change the currency because a lot is being torn, or for other reasons, you know, the nation may want to honor new, you can say, heroes by changing the currency to reflect those heroes in the currency. So there are all kinds of things for changing the currency. Now, to look at the currency as something that will stop corruption, and I listened to a bit of your discussion, that is very unorthodox for all kinds of reasons. At least as somebody observed just recently, there are already laws in the books, laws and regulations to do that. And of course, the government can always introduce new laws, new ways of implementing those regulations to make sure that they do the work of curbing corruption, whether it's vote buying or whether it's kidnapping and things of this sort. So it's rather strange that we brought in all kinds of reasons for this particular exercise that we are now undertaking. Now, it seems to me, again, that it should be obvious that what we are dealing with is huge logistical mistakes that have been made. It is the role of the central bank and the Mint working together, and of course, there's something wrong with the Ministry of Finance being taken on board here, and of course, the presidency. When we talk about the independence of these various portfolios, in a developing setting, you don't flaunt those independence. What concerns the citizen is that the government is working in tandem. Everybody is aware of what is happening. Of course, they don't have to be asking the question at each juncture. So it is not to flaunt independence, it is the smooth working of the various arms of government. That is what is of interest to the ordinary citizen. And of course, at the beginning of this whole talk, we had a whole lot about how is the role of the CBN to do this or do that. I don't think that really came to question, and I don't think anybody will question it. For as long as we've been a nation since 1960, of course, we've worked towards making an independent central bank so that they are not influenced by politics or other considerations when they are implementing monetary policy. And monetary policy is really the management of money supply, the management of all kinds of financial instruments, financial fiduciary instruments. It's not so much something that we've had to argue about. And it is presumed that the central bank, because of the high quality of the people who are selected to work there, will understand exactly what their roles are in this thing. It's not so much a general policy direction. That goes to the whole government. It's the whole government that has to take responsibility. The last thing I want to mention is that nobody is coming out smelling roses, whether it's the presidency or the central bank, whether it's the reference to how so many years after independence, the only way we can stop our politicians from buying votes is to change our currency, or whether when people are shouting about policies and their impact on their various aspects of their lives, that they can then at the last minute be induced by money to say something different. So we all, the country is now looking very good in all this exercise.
Well,
okay,
just a quick one.
Question about the...
Okay.
Yes.
Please go ahead and respond to the question.
Okay, so coming to the economic question, obviously, the reason why you have to take your time, you select what you want to do, below the glare of publicity, is within the house of the central bank or within the mint. And of course they have to consult with the, never mind we talk about independence of the CBN, but they have to consult with the head of state. He has overall responsibility. The buck stops, as the saying goes, at the president's desk, so he has to know. Of course, we've since got to know that, in fact, the president was very involved, not when we started hearing it was just CBN and they quote different clauses and different sections of the Constitution. So the issue then is, you have to assess the timing. That timing is also predicated on how long it will take to do the exercise that you want to do. So that is really where it is totally up to the central bank and the advisors to come up to the government and say, you've agreed we'll do this. This is how much time we need. Every aspect of it, procuring the papers for printing, whether it is imported or locally made, the printing process itself, the logistics of identifying the various constituencies, the banks, the communities, the rural areas, all segments of this country. At that time, the people are not interested in all those details, but you have to take into account how you are going to deliver. Is it by air, by road, by trains, or a combination
then,
of all
Dr.
of that?
Kalu,
In other words, the CBN has latitude to come out and say it will take us 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. And then you can even adjust to that. Okay, give us 15% more. So by the time the public begins to know about it, the people who are going to deliver already know precisely the logistics involved. So
which leads to the question that you asked earlier, an issue you raised earlier about the Ministry of Finance being on board. Whether or not that is the case, I guess we'll have to wait to see, or follow the news to know. But in an ideal situation, when you began by saying that this is not a new policy, it's something that sovereign states do all the time, and of course that is the correct thing. However, in an ideal situation, what should be the process? For instance, the NSPMC says on a normal basis, this is a conversation that the Central Bank of Nigeria should have started with them from the very beginning from 1 year ahead. But I'm not sure whether or not that was the case in this particular instance. In an ideal situation, what agencies of government should have been on board on this? And how long, ideally, should it take for this process to be as seamless as it should have been?
Well, the presidency and the governor of the central bank, between them and all in between, advisors, the printers, and of course they should have a sense of distribution, the pattern of distribution of such materials. These are security materials, These are not things you just put on a motorway or any bus. So it is for the government to determine all those that need to be sounded to make sure that they're all on board, that the logistics will all be in place. That is what the whole essence of planning is all about. So any individual like me, I cannot just come here and read out 5 agencies. It is for them to find out all those that will be involved in the process of delivering the note to the public. In fact, that's where it should stop, to the public. They have to assess these things. Well, people cannot be right on all scores, but with the sort of thing we have seen, the whole world must be marveling. I mean, Nigerians probably don't have time to think about it. The whole world must be marveling whether this is currency change or is there something else that is happening on in this major country. This is a country that's, we're 7th in population, and certainly in Africa we are #1 in GDP and the rest of it. So people must be marveling. What is going on in this country? So all those who are responsible for delivering to the client, it is their business, it is their responsibility to find out from the onset just how long it will take, depending on how many currencies they are changing. Are they changing 3? Are we changing the whole works? Are we even going to, somebody will talk about coins and so on and so forth. Whatever is involved, the logistics have to be very carefully put together. It is very apparent that we did not do that. And, well, we can't keep talking about that. The issue now is how do we move ahead? So I think the logistics are really the problem, not a question of jurisdiction.
Before we talk about
a lot of sophistry for us to be debating whether it's CBN or the government or the Supreme Court and so on. These were not really the original issues. The issues were how come these currencies were not available when people started showing up at the banks at the time they were supposed to be able to change their currencies. You know,
yes,
so
Dr.
that
Kalu,
is the crux of the matter.
Good morning, sir.
Yes?
Yes, before we begin to talk about how to move ahead, in understanding if the logistics were properly arranged before it was executed, let's refer to paragraph 7B of the president's speech, and he says the proportion of currency outside banks grew from 78% in 2015 to 85% in 2022. As of October 2022, therefore, currency in circulation had risen to 3.23 trillion naira. And I could go on, but if we refer to the CBN governor's, feedback after the policy implementation began, he said, I think 2.1 trillion naira had been mopped up, from circulation. But here we are, headline inflation figures announced days ago suggest that inflation has risen to 21.82%. And the goal of, the withdrawal of money from circulation was to rein in on the cash reserve and, by extension, inflation. So hasn't the first goal and the ultimate goal of this currency redesign been defeated, Doctor?
Well, I agree there, but you see, we've been very... I read the speech rather quickly. Some of the figures that you should use to make these comparisons are not even reflected. I'm sure it's not the president's fault. Maybe it's the people who are drafting. If you mention the volume of money supply out there at that point, you should also tell us what is there now. Now, they only talked about how much has been mopped up. So, as I said, you see, another big mistake, yes, using this opportunity to have a bit of control over money supply outside of the banking system is an important goal. But it is not currency redesign that I usually use for that. There are all kinds of financial instruments. Like you mentioned about cash reserve ratios, liquidity ratios, and so on and so forth. And of course, everybody knows about the use of interest rates, deposit rates. These are things that a client, whether an individual or a business, will look at to realize the cost to them of not putting as much money in the bank to earn interest as possible. So the central bank itself should have realized, and I'm sure they did, how this whole thing was going on, how much more money was now getting out of the system. That is part of the reason why we had to have a whole range of institutions, right down to the rural areas, People's Bank, microfinance banks, and so on and so forth. Not so much in terms of the capital base for such an institution, but to make sure that there's penetration of banking facilities. So we cannot blame that on the public. In fact, it is the financial institutions, the central bank and its branches and of course, indirectly, the entire government. That is what you refer to as monetary policy. Monetary policy does not really, it's only narrowly inclusive of money, design and change of money. The monetary policies are the policies, the reserve, cash reserve ratios, and the use of all kinds of financial and fiduciary instruments to make sure that you have control of most of your money, so that when you now announce policies to tighten up money supply or to loosen up money supply, that it impacts on as much of the money supply as possible. But it's not by itself an instrument that people use. I mean, countries don't just keep changing their currency because they want to improve the effectiveness of monetary policy. So I think that should be very obvious.
Let me ask you what your fears are right now.
Right.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are clear, sir. You talked about, some figures that are not missing, so it's not allowing for proper comparison. But I wonder what your fears are right now, given just how this policy has now been implemented and how we're moving forward. Let me give you an instance. We're getting reports now that in rural areas where trading is primarily done in cash, that in some places farmers have had to crash the price of their goods because they're not able to get, what they have priced their goods at. So they're settling for whatever it is that they're able to get. Do you think that this could have an effect, one, on, even though we have not seen that in the January figures, do you think it could have an effect on inflation, or do you think it could contract the economy, as the case might be?
Well, if you want to lower inflation by all costs, you can set up a battalion to shoot traders so they don't go to the market. So I'm trying to be fictitious about all this fetish concern for inflation and so on and so forth. The other side of the coin is supply. So one of the reasons why this program, I wouldn't call it policy, because I'm sure the Central Bank cannot come up with a policy to contract the economy. They cannot do that. To do it in the way we've done it, by reducing the volume of cash, the volume of money, therefore, required to effect transactions that bring into the market real production, as you said, crops, grains, vegetables, meat, you name it, workers, transportation, communications. This policy affects the entire value chain. It impacts on the whole industrial matrix. So there cannot be an effective policy or a beneficial policy when you take actions that will affect the entire value chain. From the farmland, anybody should be, any economist, or for that matter, non-economists, should be able to see the deep impact of just a violent interruption in the transactions level. So people in the farms cannot buy fresh fish, fresh produce cannot be procured, fresh produce cannot be stored because of absence of the things to keep it fresh, transportations are halted, and so on and so forth. So obviously, this could not be the intended impact of a money currency change. So we should be absolutely clear that this cannot be a justification. We cannot be quoting a decline of inflation as a measure of the success of what we are doing. In fact, that we should be talking about those things already begins to worry somebody. I'm not just a former minister, I'm also a client in a bank. I buy things, and I've seen what has happened in some banks. It's absolutely unbelievable. That was not supposed to be the case. So we should not be citing a deceleration of inflation, which I've heard is most, this is a roundabout way. Just as I said, to say that Nigerians are complaining, like most people in other developing countries have been complaining about this policy or that policy, and that the only way to make them vote to put people who will to vote out those who they think have created this policy is to induce them by money. That doesn't say very much for our own voters, you know, or to think that our own politicians that we think should come up and make responsible policies will rely on this method as the only way they can get into office. Of course, we know that the fact is some do, but how many of those do? How many of them do, to the extent that we are now imposing a draconian set of macroeconomic policies, like change of currency, withholding some currencies? I mean, this is downright unbelievable. And as I said, the whole world must be marveling. I was astounded to hear a comment from the IMF, for instance, because the IMF, I used to work at the World Bank. I know that they're in charge of fiduciary and tariff issues globally, but they've never had to make any comment. This is the single most important attribute of our sovereignty. So they must have felt so compelled to just say something. They were not supposed to say anything. They can't tell us how to distribute our currency. It is presumed that our financial and monetary experts, authorities, know exactly what to do. That is the question that we are really discussing. So we can't be citing deceleration of inflation. Or when we cite that, of course, we look at employment. We should look at the suffering. People are dying. At least we have had the case. I know that the media these days, we never can be absolutely sure what those videos portray, whether they are true or not. But I have seen myself enough to say that something is very seriously wrong with what we are trying to do and how we are trying to implement it. And you notice I say what we are trying to do, that is the policy elements that we are trying to get at. Are these the right instruments to get at those objectives? Those are questions that are still subject to serious analysis. So the fact that something is in print doesn't make it a perfect policy. Certainly not. Not in the US, not in Australia, and certainly not in Nigeria. So we have to look at the objectives and look at the instruments we are employing to reach those objectives. So to fight inflation, or the government wants to fight inflation. Of course, there are so many ways to fight inflation. As I said, it is the instrumentality
I think what I'm,
of monetary
Doc, if I may come in here, I think, please.
Yes, please.
I think what I'm actually trying to get you to do is make a prediction as to what you think will happen. Because if government says that what they want to do is, you know, they want to have a hold of the money in circulation, and perhaps they also believe that this will bring down inflation, etc. I think what I'm asking you to do is make a prediction. Do you think that this can actually have any effect whatsoever on inflation, or this has the capacity to contract the economy? That's one. And then two, if we're already, you know, not getting this right, do you think that with the pronouncement of the president yesterday, making some concessions, even though it has caused a legal uproar, do you think that it has any capacity to perhaps put us back on the right path in 60 days?
Well, macroeconomics is not physics or chemistry, if I might say. So, yes, of course, one can make predictions. The prediction clearly is that there will be a contraction in the economy. But I can only say that if I assume that we are not going to do anything else, what we have to do is not just introduce more money into circulation, something closer to what was withdrawn, but there are other corporate policies, other essential policies. And there are other ways of judging success. You see, as I mentioned already, employment is one, reproduction is another, and not just inflation happens to be one of the important ones, but there are at least 5 or 6 other things that you have to look at before you now say, oh, it has had salutary effect. The suffering, the impact on health, the impact on transportation, the impact on schools. This will impact on schools, feeding in schools, boarding houses where people have to go and buy this thing, because the policy as put together on this occasion should have taken into account just where we stand on all these variables. So my prediction is also predicated on what we are going to do next. I think the action that the president has taken is in the right direction. And I heard how it was said it will be done immediately. Now, how do you distribute how much? As I said, again, we are not told how much of these 200, what does it amount to? How much additional money are you talking about? This additional money, how have you planned how you're going to distribute to all the states, including the federal capital, to all the towns, to all the small villages, and so on and so forth? Even when we're talking about the other ones will continue to be legal tender. Now, what arrangements have you made to make sure that as you now introduce more new notes, which, by the way, we have to specify how will this come, how much of these new notes do we expect to come in over what period? That's a whole lot of specific logistics that have to accompany any proper prediction of what will happen. So yes, of course, if you curtail the money supply, it will bring down inflation, but you have to check on what it does to production, what it does to employment. You understand what I'm saying? So it's not a unidimensional measure of success. You have to take all the other factors that you have to be married together. That's why we call it stability. In the macrodynamics, the stability is when all those issues are in balance and not when one is jacked down. Of course, you can do all kinds of draconian things to bring down inflation, but what happens? People may be in the streets, and the people may be suffering, they are starving, they are so on and so forth. In the meantime, because nobody is producing, because there's no cash, of course the inflation will come down. If inflation comes down, you are curtailing the demand for not just Naira, you're also curtailing the demand for foreign exchange to the extent that a lot of our domestic production has a high foreign exchange content. You see? So all these things are all interrelated. That's why I was taking my time to answer your question so that we are very clear on what one is trying to say.
Dr. Kalu, I'd like to know what the measure of cash in circulation Nigeria needs to have, statutorily, in comparison with the entire amount of money, in the economy. Given the breakdown that was given, it was 51 trillion naira, and with the withdrawal of 2.1 trillion naira from circulation, that's less than 5%. For the economy to thrive, how much money in circulation does it need to have in comparison to the entire value of the money in its economy? And this is the reason I ask, given what has been withdrawn from circulation now, there are no transactions in the banks. I mean, I called my bank requesting a specific amount of money, and I was told money is not coming in, so they can't give me that amount of money that I'm requesting. So what's the implication of this, and how much really does Nigeria need to have in comparison to the entire money of its economy size?
Well, the first inkling of what we have done, I think it was the governor of Kaduna State, Malam El-Rufai, who mentioned at least the first set of numbers, which is rather strange, because to be discussing these things, I mean, you are saying exactly the right thing. To be discussing these things without specifics, he talked about how 2 trillion was withdrawn and only 300 billion was produced. Clearly, this is a tiny fraction, something less than 1/6 of what was withdrawn. So definitely by the time you are getting to 5/6 or thereabouts, or something close to 85%, then in fact, if you are getting to close to that amount, I'm not suggesting that's the exact amount, but definitely, when you are short of what you withdrew by 1.7 trillion, that already tells you that it is totally insufficient. The question that is darted at you is that, oh, do you want us to introduce what we withdrew if we are going to fight inflation? Of course not. And the question goes back, how much do you think you should put back if you actually withdrew 2 trillion? So the answer, of course, will depend on the structure of the economy. And in any case, when you're talking about the economic structure, it's not something that you review in quarterly terms or even in annual terms. This has to be phased out over a period. All the changes in the structure of production, the structure of financing, the introduction of new modes of financing, new instrumentalities, and so on and so forth. So even in America, even in Canada, of course, people have to use cash.
Yeah.
The idea of cashless was never meant to define absence of cash. It was to say the progressive intrusion of non-cash into the entire cash volume of transactions. So for Nigeria, obviously, it has to be as close to what you withdrew as possible before you start quibbling
and
as
clearly,
to whether you should do more.
Clearly,
but here we are.
Yeah. My apologies, Dr. Khan, because we're running out of time.
It was a tiny fraction.
Yeah.
A tiny fraction. That is why people were alarmed. And you can see it. I'll get stories from the villages, from my own area and so on. People are perplexed. Old women, old men, artisans, private doctors, lawyers. Some of them have no clue what is happening. So
especially, Dr. Kalu, at a time when a good number of people are still also wondering if this is indeed a cashless policy, it means that there should be infrastructure to support it, given the economic transfer. I mean, so digital transfers, e-money and all of those things ought to come to play. But one is wondering, with delays in transactions, even within from the one bank to the same bank, to the same one account to another account in the same bank, takes a little longer than normal, and one is wondering exactly what this is all going.
I mean, it was Geoffrey Chaucer who coined the term newfangledness. For all intents and purposes, non-cash transactions are newfangledness to the developing world. And to many parts of the developed world. These are new gadgets. A lot of the older people don't even have it. And I don't think one Nigerian needs to tell another Nigerian the fact that these are new concepts. But the way people sit in the capitals or within the halls of the banks or central banks or otherwise and talk about the fact that you just go to a pose, you get to this, you transfer this, you transfer that, shows a certain lack of familiarity, or it's like people are up in the sky. They have no idea of what's on ground.
There are countless questions, Dr.
It was never meant to be cashless in that sense. You're absolutely right.
There are countless questions to ask you, Dr. Kalu, but we have completely run out of time. Countless questions to ask you. What agencies of government should be a part of this? What industries should partner with the CBN in this? How long should it take in an ideal situation? Countless questions to ask you, but we have completely run out of time at this time. We have to thank you very much for being a part of our program this morning. Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu is a former Minister of Finance, and as he said, is also an experienced Nigerian. Thank you so much for being a part of our program this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay.